Reading D&D Aloud with Ben Riggs and Dr. Scott M. Bruner. Episode 26. Who really created Dungeons and Dragons?
Greeting once again to Reading D&D Aloud with me, your apparently controversial podcaster, historian, and journalist. And with me, as always, is the magnanimous, the magnificent, the munificent Dr. Scott Bruner. How you doing this Sunday, Scott?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm struggling with the fact that I look so dark and I'm not sure what to do about it. I have a light right here and the window's open, and normally that's enough, but now I'm in shadow, as though I've crossed into Mordor. But, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, for those of you who are just listening on the podcast, he looks like Bela Lugosi. That's not true at all. I'm not even looking.
My grandpa looked like Bela Lugosi, which I thought was so cool. William Kowalkowski was his name, Polish immigrant to America, and Bela Lugosi look-alike. Like, he could have made money in the 1950s, I think, running around looking like Bela Lugosi. He looked so much like Bela Lugosi.
It's interesting. We're bringing up Bela Lugosi just a couple weeks past. A couple weeks past when we talked so much about the Strahd campaign, which is interesting. And I'm looking at my giant Strahd box set in front of me. Amazing how the archetype and the myth of Dracula is everywhere. Even when I just think to be in darkness, instantly I go to Bela Lugosi. But before we bury the lead, Ben, why are you controversial?
I don't know. How can you see yourself as others see you? But I was on a podcast this week. It was one of those YouTube / podcasts like ours, and I was introduced as autistically truthful and controversial.
Huh.
So
I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what you would have made of that.
I mean, it explains some things. Because again, like, you can't see yourself as others see you.
Right.
I certainly don't get up in the morning and think, what controversial thing can I do or say today? But I write what I write, I say what I say, and people take it as they will. I don't know. Maybe it was the the same guy who's like the Golden Age of role-playing games is over is also like, and Gygax was a misogynist. Maybe it's that 1-2 punch this year. But I will, since this is for our podcast audience, I will confess that I was deeply irritated by some of the criticism of John Peterson and Jason Tondro over their original D&D book, especially from Rob Kuntz, who was one of the original D&D authors, who wrote this very odd going to war screed about it. Because I mean, Rob Kuntz should know better. He was there. He was there. He knew Gygax.
I think we've had this conversation here. I'm constantly fascinated by Rob Kuntz, and I find, it's interesting to me. I wonder how many other people maybe share something of, you and I are kind of both share kind of fascination with this kind of this strange little history, this rather subgenre of a historical period of the creation of this game that it's now completely entangled with our culture. Rob Kuntz I always find fascinating. I was thinking about, and in some ways, it's like, some people really get into soap operas or Games of Thrones or whatever. They love these little moments of drama. Yours and mine probably very much is around this 1970s. Mine is probably more the 1970s. I think yours guys probably goes from the 70s, 80s, and the 90s as well. But I mean, Rob Kuntz is such a fascinating character in all of this. I don't know how much folks know about it, but Rob Kuntz is one of those people that if I'm going in a rabbit hole some night on the internet, I will find myself reading all the things he's written. I bought his, the Genius of Dave Arneson, the small little kind of booklet that he made that was supposed to be part of a larger work that I don't know how it's been released. I'm realizing right now, and I could turn on the internet, but I'm not in the mood, is that he actually has released something new. And he releases through his imprint. He does release modules from time to time, but I'm digressing.
Yeah, I was trying to look up in Peterson's Game Wizards for a brief who was Rob Kuntz. Could you tell the audience who Rob Kuntz is or was?
Absolutely. And this is again, these are the moments where I'm where it's hard for me. It's funny, you were just talking about being self-aware, where I'm self-aware. I'm like, why is it that I find some of these people so fascinating when I go back to them, thinking in terms of soap opera, the people that were so instrumental to the creation of this hobby. But Rob Kuntz was a young gentleman around the time that Dungeons and Dragons was being created. He comes from a really rough upbringing. If I'm not mistaken, he lost his parents, and Gary Gygax became like basically a surrogate father to him. He was always around the Lake Geneva homestead. What's the name of the Center Street, where D&D was being created. I think he might have even predated Center Street, but I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, Gary Gygax very much brought him in, made him very much part of that early wargaming community, and he was there kind of from the beginning, hanging out with Ernie Gygax and the others, the Gygax girls. Oh man, that their names are Heidi and Elise. I felt
You
bad for
got it.
that. I didn't want to put the listen Gygax. Anyway, moving on. But and then yeah, he helped with I don't know he's got a fair number of credits out there on early works, but not as many as you would expect for somebody that was there from the ground floor. Like his name appears here and there, certainly as a playtester. Is it Legends and Lore that I think he may have his name on the cover? And if I'm not mistaken, that might be the only book that he has that has himself on the
I
cover.
want to say he co-wrote Greyhawk. Like,
Yeah, that
I'm pretty sure he co-wrote one of the really early OD&Ds, because that was something I criticized in my article. But let me Google and make sure it was Greyhawk. But you go ahead.
Yeah, and I remember reading one story once that he'd hoped that at some point that Gary Gygax would adopt him, and that didn't happen. And again, there's without probably bringing up some really kind of ugly, I imagine, family history, getting the truth about exactly what the relationship was and how it changed throughout Dungeons and Dragons and Kuntz worked at TSR for a while. I want to say he worked. Oh my goodness, I know there was bad blood in this. This is now you're asking me to remember again, thanks to John Peterson's Game Wizards book. I'm kind of going through trying to remember exactly what he did. I know that he very much saw when TSR did become a business and was bringing in money, and I think, as everybody knows, sometimes Gary Gygax wasn't the easiest person to work with. He kind of had a legendary anger. I don't think business was probably Gary Gygax's jam, and I think he was irritated because people didn't see the business the same way, and that's when I think the severing of his relationship with Rob Kuntz probably began. And at some point, and this is probably why I find it so interesting, at some point, Rob Kuntz went being from a Gary Gygax. I was gonna say from a Gary Gygax guy to a Dave Arneson guy, but that's not, that again, that's so much fueling the concept that there's some like binary split between the two. Obviously, Gygax and Arneson had a terrible split, and then they were Arneson was suing him for royalties. Some of those lawsuits were successful, some not he didn't get everything he wanted, but Kuntz definitely seemed to side with Arneson's argument and has continued to do so. And again, the book that Kuntz has released, the small book that I read, which is strange is the best way to describe it, is very much a advocacy for it was Dave Arneson who created Dungeons and Dragons. Gary Gygax, sure kind of took the idea and ran with it. I mean, but I mean, the name of the thing is Dave Arneson's True Genius, and that's the claim, that's the entire thesis of this kind of book, is that it was the only thing that was new about Dungeons and Dragons came from Dave Arneson, not Gary Gygax. And I've always found it kind of interesting that this person that was on the ground floor in Lake Geneva, not part of the Minnesota team, would eventually kind of disavow Gygax entirely. And certainly for it seems like a number of reasons, but that rift has continued to grow throughout time. That Rob Kuntz continues to. I'm always curious, like if I'm not mistaken, Terry Kuntz is his brother. Terry Kuntz does go to Gary Con, but I don't think Rob Kuntz has ever gone or probably would consider going. I do think he lives in France now, which probably makes it difficult. But anyway, there's my rundown of who Rob Kuntz is.
Let me just read the back of Dave Arneson's True Genius for you here. The first book ever written on D&D's co-designer by Robert J. Kuntz, published by 3 Line Studio, April 2017. This 72-page, 6x9-inch perfect bound book presents 3 linked essays forming the first major treatise on David L. Arneson, the man behind the role-playing frenzy that swept the nation 1974 onward and that continues to this very day worldwide. And all of it, as revealed herein, based upon a unique systems architecture he invented and utilized for his make-believe campaign World Blackmore circa 1971. This extensively researched work reveals that Arneson broke with 2,000 years of game design history and theory by creating and implementing a transcendent system structure never before conceived of in the history of games or play. The author examines and explains Arneson's evolutionary systems architecture, that the design dimension qualities of Arneson's system structure are still in their embryonic stages due to his original concept being redacted for a less robust system, and by the very company which was catapulted from a basement concern to a near $1 million business almost overnight, while at first championing it. That outstanding claims that the RPG concept, as first made available commercially as original Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, is descended from the game Chainmail are incorrect and stem from assumptive leaps of logic not consonant with design theory or systems theory. Both of the latter's knowledge bases are utilized by the author to debunk this ongoing fallacy. So that's, for not using the word Gygax in there once, that's a pretty intense slam on Gygax and some real praise of Arneson there. The thing that immediately jumps out at me is, okay, to anyone who's going to be like, Dave Arneson is the true genius, then I have to be like, well, what about Dave Wesley and his Brownstein games?
Sure.
And again, if anyone doesn't know, very briefly, Brownstein was a Napoleonic, it was supposed to be a Napoleonic war game, but it probably was the first true role-playing game because people came over to his house. They had characters in this town that's going to be invaded by the French. They would decide what they're going to do. They would tell Dave Wesley. He would adjudicate things. Everybody controlled only one person, and combat was not really the focus, which to me screams role-playing game. And that and Chainmail is the way I think of it. Were then adapted by Arneson, where you could your character persisted, you gained an experience, and you were exploring dungeons. And then Gygax kind of took that, polished it, published it, and again, as the publisher, he was able to, I think, secure an awful lot of the glory for himself. But also, Dave Arneson, man, like I don't know if he ever finished anything. Like, the stories I hear from people who worked with him in the industry were great guy, total genius, amazing, couldn't finish anything. His attempts to supplant D&D were constantly bedeviled by his difficulty finishing anything. Who edited Blackmore? Vietnam vet. Why can't Tim Kask?
Tim Kask. There you go.
First employee at TSR. Tim Kask, who is a Gygax partisan, so take that into account. But he was like, yeah, Arneson just gave me a box of notes and I wrote Blackmore, really. And Tim Kask was pretty angry about it 40 years later. So, again, he's a Gygax partisan, but you don't make up things about your enemies to destroy them. Usually you tell the truth about your enemies to destroy them.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I've been ranting.
No, all that stuff is fascinating and really interesting. I think it's funny that you and I often go out of our way to not be kind of part of. It was interesting. The way you put it, I thought was brilliant there, where you said, he is a Gygax partisan. And as soon as you said that, I started thinking, my gosh, if we start listing some of those TSR employees, we literally can say they became Gary people, they became Dave people at some point, right? If you had some terrible clash with Gary at some point, and, again, I think he was probably a terrible boss. It's also interesting how, the more we kind of dive into the history of these things, the narratives around these people completely change based on how. It's interesting what you said, if you tell the truth about somebody, and it doesn't matter who that person is, if you tell an unvarnished truth or people get really interested in what you're doing, you're going to dig up a lot of things about them that weren't the best things about their personality. And certainly that has happened to Gary Gygax because of kind of what he did. I just thought it was interesting, though, that you really can kind of look at some of those TSR. We try to stay away from who was the true genius. Like, we're like, maybe they were both really, and I'm not a huge fan of that word genius because I don't even know what it means anymore. But the concept is, I think, it's almost impossible to decide where one's responsibility for the creation of Dungeons and Dragons begins and the other ends, right? We can talk about, and it wouldn't have, it might have been created by somebody else, but certainly in the form that we have of it today would only be created by those two folks kind of becoming, I would say, aesthetically entangled. What is one of the things that in that Kask, Tim Kask, what an interesting, what an interesting gentleman Tim Kask is, and he's a
Great
gentleman you can
interview.
often
Great
right.
interview.
He's fun, and you can definitely see him on the hallways of Gary Con. I was in a game with him once, which was fun, but I digress. One of the things I think that Kuhn's book does get right is something that I say. And by the way, just from you reading that short portion, folks can get a sense of kind of the language in The True Genius of Dave Arneson. It is written, and I don't know what to say, because it's like I could say it's written in a faux academic style, but I don't know what academic style is. Uh, one of the things that's funny is people think that like academic writing is good. Academic writing is often some of the worst writing. If the purpose of writing is to be accessible and to communicate some form of idea, it's amazing how many academics don't quite get that. Of course, people are often in academia not because of their writing style, but because of their ideas. You get my point. So I don't know if Kunz's writing is good or bad. I as a writing teacher, I probably should be able to say I know what good writing and bad writing is. What I do know is it is not entirely inaccessible, and it does seem to be. And I don't want to say it's an affectation either, but it feels like an affectation in some ways, right? It's like trying to significantly say that, hey, I'm taking this medium really, really seriously. But there are little nuggets in Rob Kuntz's thing, and for somebody like me, I wasn't reading it necessarily for the ideas. I was more reading it from that soap opera of like, I want to know what happened between you and Gary that leads you to completely align yourself with Arneson, considering the fact that you were a young teenager that was like, really close to the family. You were considered one of the Gygaxes, I think he said apocryphally. But one of the things that, if I get back to my original point, one of the things that Kuntz does get right, I think, is getting away from the concept, the mechanics, or what the game is. He talks a lot about the open-ended approach. I think there's a word that he uses for it, the open style of gaming. This concept that you could go or do anything, which I do think is at the heart of Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is more compelling in many ways around this medium. As I said before, I'm always fascinated by, especially the type of folks that are interested in tabletop role-playing games, how much time folks spend talking about rules and mechanics. Like we could suddenly get to, and I think the rules and mechanics do have impact on games. They create different flavors and different aesthetics, themes. But at the end of the day, the thing that I think, of course, is just revelatory is that it was just some way to say, hey, it's okay to get around and just play make-believe with your friends. And I think that's actually somewhere kind of, hidden in some of that kind of strange textual lingo that Kuntz uses. He's saying the same thing, that the one thing that is revelatory, that is interesting about this thing, isn't necessarily Gygax's ability to write the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I don't agree with that, by that, because Dungeon Master's Guide is like the best book ever, but that the thing that's really that these are in many ways peripheral to the real moment of inspiration, which was like, hey, what if we just created a game that had a bunch of rules that sat around and allowed you to kind of do whatever you wanted? And as you just pointed out, does that rest with Arneson? Does that rest with Wesley? Does that rest with any of us when we were 10 years old? And just want to get back to that. So I don't know, it's an interesting question, but yeah, Rob Kuntz is an interesting fellow.
Well, again, I think that there's a preconception or desire for the singular genius who has labored away and brought us their great work. And I think the more familiar you are with actual production of
anything.
Yeah, that's fair to say. I was gonna
Right.
I was gonna say creative work, but that's almost not right, because like I think about my book, which is obviously nonfiction, and man, there's so many fingerprints all over it. Like uh, part of my process is I'll interview, write from the interviews, and then I'll send what I wrote to the people I interviewed plus the other people involved in a given story, and then they get back to me with like comments and notes and thoughts, and then those go into the next draft. And uh like it's hard to imagine what my prior book would have been without all the comment and input from those people at TSR and the people at Wizards and Peter Adkison, etc. So, and again, that's nonfiction, but again, with fiction, and then there's my editor, and oh my God, the editor, like he had so much to do with the way the book turned out. But now I'm ranting. Go ahead, Scott.
No, well, I mean, you're venturing into my field of study, which is the concept that there's no such thing as a soul genius, because there's no such thing as a soul person necessarily, right? We are all basically nothing but emergent consequences of infinite. I shouldn't say infinite, but rather large. Maybe I should say infinite relationships that we are the inevitable consequences of. Like it's interesting to hear you talk about like, well, they're the TSR editors, the folks that gave you input to your book, but what about the own subjectivity of yourself that came into it? What, your biological representation, which is, basis on the relationships from your ancestors, like all of those things, form whomever we are, or whatever we create is basically nothing but, again, emerging from the relationships that we are. And that, that's why I think you and I stay away so much from this concept of like, it's Dave was responsible. No, it's Gary, it's
well, again, I feel like
tastes great, less filling. Like that debate is absurd,
the more you stare at it, the more you have to, I think, be like, it's a real mix. Like,
and how,
it's a very the less you know, the easier it is to be like this person or that person. The more you know, the more you're like, what about Dave Wesley?
Right. And we've already talked about people that had influence on it that were completely entangled in creation. Tim Kask has input on it, right? I mean, he changed it in many ways. So did Rob Kuntz in some ways. Without him playtesting the game, it doesn't turn out. I'm sure that he had input and ideas for Gary. So Dungeons and Dragons is never created by one person. It's created by countless ideas and concepts that came to a head in 1974. We could talk about the Blooms. I mean, who didn't in some way? We do talk about the subject, Empire of Imagination by Michael Whitwer, goes back and does examine kind of the creation of the subjectivity of Gary Gygax, about how he's a product of his time. He was a product of the relationships that he had, with his wife and his children. And all of those could be ascribed as authors of D&D in some way, right?
Well, it's Sunday. Should we read?
So I created Dungeons and Dragons. It was me. You're welcome.
Should we read?
Because time is an illusion, so I was there too. I was 1 year old when D&D was created, but I was out there sending my vibes out there.
I really appreciate your enthusiasm. But it's Sunday. Should we read the DMG and talk about Jesus?
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's where we left off. Oh, yes. Yeah. Let's do this.
So we're going to talk about Cure Blindness, which means I need to read Cure Blindness from the Player's Handbook. And then we'll read it from the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then I think I need to read from the Bible.
Boy! Oh, whoa, man! We're gonna go that direction.
Yeah.
Oh boy! Okay.
So, Cure Blindness, Abjuration Reversible. Level 3, range, touch, duration permanent, area of effect, creature touched, components verbal and somatic, casting time 1 round, saving throw none. Explanation description. By touching the creature afflicted, the cleric employing the spell can permanently cure most forms of blindness. Its reverse, cause blindness, requires a successful touch upon the victim, and if the victim then makes the saving throw, the effect is negated. Okay, so pretty straightforward. I am fascinated by the most forms of blindness without listing, what it can't do. It's almost like Gygax wanted an out there just in case the DM wanted to be like, well, it doesn't work this time. But in the DMG, Gygax writes, Cure Blindness. This spell will not restore lost visual organs, whether such cause is due to injury or disease. Thus, at your option, the spell can simply remove magical blindness and cure disease or disease-like conditions, such as cataracts and glaucoma and various forms of nearsightedness, farsightedness, or astigmatisms common to human eyes. Or it can be effective against other eye disorders as well, save those noted above. So again, I find that right there to be interesting at its core, that the spell is not designed to regrow eyeballs. And I'm kind of like, why not, Gary? And I feel like the answer might be in the Bible. You want to say something, Scott, or can I read from the Bible?
No, I was from a personal basis, considering I do have an astigmatism. I'm just happy that if I run into a Dungeons and Dragons cleric, they will be able to help me. And it's the D&D version of LASIK, right? But no, please read from the Bible.
All right, so this is Gospel of John, chapter 9, New International Version. Jesus heals a man born blind. I personally prefer the King James, but I feel like the New International is just so much more readable. So, as he went along, he being Jesus here, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The Bible then tells us this word means sent, so go wash in the pool of Sent, S-E-N-T. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. All right, you want to say something or should I?
No, I'm not going to touch the Bible.
Oh,
please.
Okay. So again,
Okay.
to me, this is coming straight from Dr. Laycock, who we
Sure.
had on earlier this year, who pointed out, hey, like there's literal Bible superpowers that are put into AD&D, which was one of those obvious things that you don't realize until someone brilliant comes and points out the obvious thing that's always been in front of your face. And I would point out here that the mechanics in the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide mimic those from that story. This story where Jesus does not regrow the man's eyes. He already has eyes. Jesus just comes along and somehow cures the blindness of his eyes. And it's just, I'd looked at this spell since probably 1989. The thought never crossed my mind that it's literally a biblical superpower that has been translated into AD&D. Go ahead.
No, well, I think this ties in rather well to kind of what we were just talking about, is that you talk about, somebody creating any type of work of art, that they're going to bring in all of their perspectives or their own personal entanglements into it, right? And one of them, as we've mentioned many times on the podcast, is that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson both were rather religious. Dave Arneson was an evangelical, and of course Gary Gygax was a Jehovah's Witness. So when it comes down to writing Cure Blindness, it's not surprising that the way that he would be viewing it would be in many ways less Robert E. Howard. Not that it's even in there at all. Oh, maybe it is for all I know, but it would be more biblical, because that would be probably with kind of the forefront of his imagination. And I think you're right to say that, yeah, here's a ludic translation of a biblical superpower, and that comes from somebody who had a deep and abiding faith. So interesting. Right.
At Gen Con every year, there's Jehovah's Witnesses outside the convention hall,
really
looking for converts. Yeah.
Are they? How do they view? Now you've got me interested. How do they view the gamers? I obviously.
So funny you should ask that question. So, in prior years, I always kind of feel bad for them, because a lot of them are born into being Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's a pretty high control religion. And again, look, you're not supposed to get blood transfusions. It deeply impacted Gary, Ernie, like the whole Gygax family's lives were impacted by their Jehovah's Witnessism. It probably impacted when Gary died, because again, he couldn't get a blood transfusion. My understanding is he was saving up his own blood, which is something they can do. Well, if you're getting your own blood, it's okay, for possibly life-saving surgery. And then he died before it could happen. But that is not me quoting chapter and verse from Michael Whitwer. I think it's just something I heard. So again, please take that as a rough draft of knowledge. So in the past, I've if I had a bottle of water, sometimes I'd give him an unopened bottle of water, and I always say hi. But this year I was curious. And I had my full historian garb on mentally. So on the last day of Gen Con, I did go up to one of the groups and I said, hey, you guys know that this convention was founded by a Jehovah's Witness. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah. You guys know that the same Jehovah's Witness actually created Dungeons and Dragons. They're like, we didn't know that. I'm like, you should consider checking out Dungeons and Dragons because he wrote some Jehovah's Witness stuff into the game. And they were like, oh, that's so, again, they were just kind of polite,
Yeah,
nothing,
sure. Yep.
nothing shocking came out of it. But I was like, if they're going to stand out here for 3 days, it feels like someone should go up to them and point out all of this was done by a witness. I'm guessing no one thought that far ahead on the witness side of things. Because again, I'm kind of like it. I could see that being the thing that leads you out of witnessism, maybe. But again, the problem with this and some of the other high control religions, I believe, is if you're going to lose your family if you leave the religion, I have a problem with you. Like I was raised Catholic. I would not call myself Catholic anymore. I still hang out with my Catholic family all the time, and it's not a problem. But witnessism, again, if you leave the religion, you might lose your family. They might be told shun you essentially, and that to me is deeply troubling. But now we have wandered far, far from. Actually, maybe we haven't wandered as far as I thought. So,
Well,
want to say something, or should I read more spells?
Well, I just think I, I was thinking about this. I don't have any brilliant insight or thought on this, but one of the things that I think is interesting from the history is how often, like Gygax, because you're talking about, Gary Gygax being a Jehovah's Witness and how that kind of impacted. I mean, I think it's always strange, anybody listening to the podcast can go and watch, if you want to see one of the things that just drives me nuts. And I still feel like 60 Minutes owes Gary Gygax an apology. But if you've ever seen the 60 Minutes like special on Dungeons and Dragons, it's just it will seem so absurd to you now in 2024 when now we have, nonprofits who are teaching kids how to play Dungeons and Dragons in school. We talk about the pedagogical benefits. We talk about, all the social benefits of role-playing games. And in 1982, we were talking about how, this game was, 60 Minutes truly does. And now we're venturing, of course, into Dr. Laycock territory, but Dungeons and Dragons was very much contextualized as, even in the mainstream media, like it wasn't just the Pat Pullings necessarily. It wasn't just the folks kind of on the edge of the evangelicals that were really up in arms around this thing. There were all 60 Minutes, which I would call kind of like a mainstream media organization, really contextualize D&D like they did for, Corporeal. And if everybody knows the classic, 60 Minute style of like, kind of going after an organization or being rather critical of them, and they do that. They give it the full treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I like, I can summarize briefly because I watched this a ton for my book. It'll be things like, Patricia Pulling's son Bink killed himself, and she blames your game. What do you have to say about that, Mr. Gygax? Like,
yeah,
holy crap! Come on.
Yeah, and I'm paraphrasing as well, but there's moments where they're like, Gary Gygax, this is just a game, the gold, you can't spend the gold in real life. But at the same time, can we look past, why can't they take a look at all of these compelling cases? And it's like, none of these are particularly compelling at all if you like looked at them more than probably the way that, William Deere was was presenting it to, I don't know, the folks at 60 Minutes. But the thing I was going to say is, it's interesting how there's many times in Gary Gygax's early career where he would leave and even before predating the publication Dungeons and Dragons, he would often leave the wargaming community for stretches of time because he would say things like, hey, I've got to get back to my faith and my family. Those things are more important, and wargaming is getting in the way. And he, like they just keep pulling me back in. Like The Godfather, Gary Gygax would always eventually return to the wargaming community, and then at some point never really leave again. But we talk about entanglements, we talk about subjectivity. You can see that at some point Gary Gygax was probably wrestling with his faith and his own relationship to this game. And I imagine moments like that 60 Minute special were some ways kind of troubling, and I'm sure he found them kind of absurd because he was coming from a perspective where he believed deeply in his religion, and people were saying that his game was completely opposed to it and antagonizing, was evil and dark. And again, yeah, I don't know. I was interested to see whether the modern day Jehovah's Witness out of Gen Con were thinking, that the games were, whether there was still maybe that contextualization that these games that folks were playing was something that maybe people shouldn't be doing, or whether it's like, oh, these are games and these are just people like standing on any street corner, or whether it was different, actually on the pavement outside the large arena of Gen Con.
I mean, my take on things is they're assigned a corner and they go and they stand on it and they do it because they're told.
Sure.
But like I have, again, for the past few years, I've kind of conscientiously been like, I'm gonna be nice to them because again, I feel fundamentally bad for them, and I'm sorry if there's any witness listeners who are like, Ben, you've got the religion all wrong. Maybe I do, but from where I stand and what I've heard from ex Jehovah's Witnesses, it sounds like again, if you're not on that street corner with those people, you're going to hear about it from someone at your church, and your church is pretty deeply entangled in your life, and you don't necessarily actually have the freedom to be like, I want to stay home and watch the Colts this Sunday.
Yeah,
Instead, you're going to be out standing in front of Gen Con. So I don't. I'm skeptical that they even get some sort of like marching orders of like you're going to talk to a bunch of people who think they're playing a game but are actually Satanists.
yeah,
Like I don't even know
right.
because I've never heard a speech from them like
Yeah,
that. Uh, it's no different than if I see them at an airport. They just I say hi, they say hi back. But interestingly, again, I've never had one ever actually try to sell me the religion.
right. Yeah. I was going to say, one of my favorite people in the whole world is Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller, the magician duo, and he is a well-known hardcore atheist, and he says something that I've always thought was kind of funny, was he talks around, when folks kind of, are evangelizing, proselytizing in any type of way, or trying to get converts to their religion. He's like, these people are concerned about my everlasting soul. These people are like literally, because of their belief system, they think that if I don't come around to the religion or the way that they view the world, that I'm going to be, cast into a sea of eternal damnation. And their response to that is, I'm going to try to save someone. He's like, the people that I get upset with are the people that think that could happen to me and don't even try it, are like fine with it, which I always thought was kind of funny. I mean, there's something to be said, I think, for the fact that people, everybody has their kind of different faiths or belief systems on the universe, but I'm always going to align with those that are kind of interested in taking some type of responsibility for the relationships that we necessarily have, right, that are concerned with their fellow man in some way. So I have no problem with it. I think it's kind of interesting, but there's
Should we
something
do
else I was going to say.
should we do dispel magic?
Yeah, well, that I was gonna say, my last comment. This is on the Dave Arneson side. Is he was another person who, I don't know where he went, but he did for his church. And I don't exact. Do you know what religious affiliation Dave Arneson was?
I'd have to look it up, but I know that he was a serious Christian in some way and went on
Yeah,
a mission trip, I think, to Central America. But
that's what I
I'm
thought
not
too.
enough of an expert to speak any more about it than that.
Yeah, the point being, these were two people that were deeply, very much strong men of faith, right? And so it's not surprising, I suppose, if we get to back the book, that would from time to time emerge.
Okay. On that note, let us look at Dispel Magic from page 47 in your first edition player's handbook. Dispel Magic, Abjuration, level 3. Range 6 inches, duration permanent, area of effect 3-inch cube, components verbal and somatic, casting time 6 segments, saving throw none. When a cleric casts this spell, it neutralizes or negates the magic it comes in contact with as follows. A Dispel Magic, yeah, that's the way it's written. A Dispel Magic will not affect a specially enchanted item, such as a scroll, magic ring, wand, rod, staff, miscellaneous magic item, magic weapon, magic shield, or magic armor. It will destroy magic potions. They are treated as 12th level for the purposes of this spell. Remove spells cast upon persons or objects, or counter the casting of spells in the area of effect. The base chance for success at a Dispel Magic spell is 50%. For every level of experience of the character casting the Dispel Magic above that of the creature whose magic is being dispelled, or above the efficiency level of the object, yeah, I said that right, or above the efficiency level of the object from which the magic is issuing, the base chance increases by 5%, so that if there are 10 levels difference, there is a 100% chance. For every level below the experience level of the creature slash object, the base chance is reduced by 2%. Note that this spell can be very effective when used upon charmed and similarly beguiled creatures. It is automatic in negating the spellcaster's own magic. That's really... Oh, I guess that makes sense. So for the first thing that jumps out at me there is the casual throwaway of, oh, you can use this to stop the spells of someone casting against you right now. Like it introduces counter magic in a very casual, offhanded manner. But that almost seems like it would be the primary use of the spell is, oh, someone's casting death against me. Better counter that spell.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a big use. One of the things that man, one of the things, oh my goodness, gobble, blah, excuse me. One of the mechanics that we have completely lost somewhere along the ways of the evolution of Dungeons and Dragons and even in the OSR community was the concept of, and it definitely can bog down combat, but one of the things when I was running first edition that we really liked is the concept of segments in a combat round. And there's still turns in a combat round, even in fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, but what there aren't necessarily, I can't think of other than ritual spells, any type of spell that doesn't take like one action to do. We have gotten so to the point that it's like, that is really the easiest way. But back in first edition D&D, spells took different periods of time to cast. So off the top of my head, I wanted to say that maybe sleep has like 4 or 6 segments. So you begin casting the spell, and the dungeon master or the players together kind of have to say, okay, in 6 segments this thing is going to go off, which gives other folks, I don't know what the segment casting time of dispel magic is, but if it's faster, and my guess is it probably is, you can dispel that spell, or you could simply do damage to the spellcaster, because unlike a concentration of 5th edition, which by the way is a better mechanic than first editions of just getting hit and you lose it, I like the concentration concept, but because spells took different time, and it certainly gave. Well, I love the concept of segments. I love the concept that there's spellcasters out there and you can see them, but it also adds a little bit of flavor of the concept that you can see them kind of waving their arms and throwing some of the somatic components into the air, rather than, again, the kind of superhero way that we think about it today is where, Cyclops is just pressing the side of his visor and instantly it's a magic missile. But again, my point is early editions of D&D had different time bases for different spells. And so something like Dispel Magic could be used in the midst of combat to interrupt a spell, although it would be easier just to hit the spellcaster.
All right, let's see what Gygax has to say about this. Dispel Magic from page 41 in the Dungeon Master's Guide. If this spell is cast upon a magic item, it most certainly will have the effect of causing it to be non-operational for one round thereafter, if the item does not make a saving throw. If the item is not in the possession of any creature, then the item gets no saving throw and it is non-operational for one round. Note that artifacts and relics are not subject to this effect. Any Dispel Magic spell must be cast directly at the object, not anything or anyone else to be so effective. Which again sounds like a direct contradiction of the player's handbook, where it has a long list of magic items that it can't be used on, and here it's like, well, it can, just not relics and artifacts, I think. Just not artifacts and relics, but anything else, sure, cast away, it's just only going to stop it for one round. It feels to me almost like the Dungeon Master's Guide is at times a revision of the player's handbook.
Sure. What's response? I mean, it's absolutely, it's point counterpoint, right? We've said this before in the cast, is like the player's handbook is very much around, here's what you can do, and the DM's guide is very much like, okay, now we've seen what they will do with this. This is what you need to stop them from doing.
Yeah, this is the rare moment when it looks like the Dungeon Master's Guide actually gives a more generous interpretation than the player's handbook, because, I mean, Dispel Magic, like, it seems like it should work against magic stuff. Hey, in 5th edition, does it have that same system of, like, look at the levels involved and do math and then make a roll? Do you recall?
Off the top, I'm sure that it's much, much more streamlined than necessarily having to worry about, tables, charts, and percentages. But off the top, I'm trying to remember the last time anybody's. So I feel like this. It's funny. I almost think that it's almost intuitive. Like nobody would try in 2024 to cast Dispel Magic on the Eye of Vecna, right? We're like, nah, it's not going to work on that. But I can think of lots of times where people are casting Dispel Magic on a like a magically sealed door or things like that. I cannot think of any time, and maybe this is a good question for our Discord listeners, if anybody can think of a time that somebody cast Dispel Magic on an item. But I mean, it's certainly not a bad idea if you're fighting a major spellcaster who's got, some kind of like staff of fireball. That seems to make a lot of sense to cast Dispel Magic on that thing. But I can't think of, and I've played a fair amount of Dungeons & Dragons, I can't think off the top of my head, it probably has happened, and just no memories are coming clear about moments in combat where somebody was slinging Dispel Magic. In many ways, I think a Dispel Magic in my head is more of one that you use out of combat more often, again, to stop, minor wards placed on objects. Get rid of an illusion, for instance, right? This wall may be fake. I'm going to cast, I can't disbelieve the illusion, but if it's a magic illusion, then Dispel Magic will work for me. So let me cast that.
All right. So we should probably wind down a little bit. As always, I want to remind you that we are available wherever fine podcasts can be found. If there's a place that we are not found that you'd like us to be found, shoot me an email. I am admin at readingdndaloud.net, I think. I think it's .net. If not, find me on Twitter or Facebook and tell me there. But we have a Patreon, which gets you access to our Discord, where only the most enlightened and erudite and fascinating people gather to share their thoughts and opinions on the great hobby of gaming. It also grants you access to seminars I have done at Gen Con and other conventions over the past few years. In the month of September, we have released my seminar entitled The Battle for the Soul of D&D from Gen Con 2024. It is the seminar in which I go over everything that Wizards of the Coast employees have told me upon leaving the company in the past 6 months. If you're looking for a sequel to Slaying the Dragon, like the germ of it is definitely in this seminar. So if you want the hottest of hot gossip, please, it's only $3 a month. Hop on in. You'll also get access to my seminar on 4th edition from Gen Con last year. All of that is on the Patreon page. So please, I think that's worth the value of a cup of coffee a month. And we have this going on for, probably 6 to 8 months. I think I have material for. So we'll let you know when we don't have that material anymore, obviously, and then we'll jump off the bridge when we get to it. But
Can I ask you? Can I ask you a question? I love. This is the second week in a row where at the end of the session, I'm like, man, I have a question that I really want to ask Ben about. And this may be a longer one. Maybe we'll have to end on a cliffhanger here and say for the answer from Ben Riggs, you will have to join us next week. Saying about channel, but here's my question to you. But I talked a lot around the concept that I go down these rabbit holes. Folks like Rob Kuhn's kind of, get me really curious about early in the history. It's why I've read, and I'm happy to share, but I'm not going to today, why I'm so interested in. But I'm curious, Ben, why do you find this segment of history, especially tabletop role-playing games, so compelling that you have devoted so much of your attention and interest in studying it? What is it that fascinates you about?
I mean, it is the songs of our people,
Sure.
is the short answer. And I would say at this point, I'm very interested by the ragged edge where creativity meets capitalism. And I think that the desire to make profit for shareholders and the desire to make an amazing product do not always meet what you would think, if Adam Smith were here, he would say, well, the best creative product will be the most profitable because it is the best, and therefore it will make the most money, and capitalism works. Yay! But in practice, there are all sorts of things that cause problems with that. One of them being that institutionally, creatives are not super interested in running companies, and when they do, they're not super good at it. Like, look at Gary Gygax.
Right.
Creative who's suddenly running a company and is not very good at it. But when he was running the company, he was certainly very concerned about the product, even when he was wrong-headed about it.
Yep.
But now, almost always, you have some sort of bean counter in charge of these creative projects. And because they're in charge, they get to have their say. But the problem often is that they are not themselves a creative. So they will have ideas like, make a version of D&D that will appeal to World of Warcraft players. And the creatives dutifully go off and do that. And they make a version of D&D that probably does appeal to World of Warcraft players and actually has interesting and fun mechanics. This is 4th edition.
Right.
But the core base of the game does not want that. And when it comes out, they're kind of like, this is weird. I don't get it. And yet, like the designers of, again, I think Haynes, Collins, and Wyatt, anyone who maligns them as designers, in the main, I think is wrong-headed on the topic because they were given instructions by their bosses. They went and they did them. And it's the boss's fault that that was the wrong product at the wrong time. But it's pretty hard to imagine Haynes, and Collins, and Wyatt having the juice at Wizards to be like, no, we're just not going to do that. And they would have been fired and someone else would have been put in their place to make fourth edition and make something that would appeal to World of Warcraft players. So that is what I find perhaps the most fascinating. And again, you can't tell the story of the rest of the hobby without the story of D&D. Like the OSR is very much a reaction to that that trend at Wizards of the Coast to make these kind of for-profit mass products. Yesterday, Questing Beast, Ben, whose last name I can't remember, put out a video where he was like, so here are some really big mistakes in Wizards and TSR adventures from over the years. Here's one from Vecna Eve of Ruin. Here's one from, I think, Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And, I think he says at some point, like, why are we still making these mistakes? Wizards of the Coast. And the reason that was one of them was, why are they using railroads? Why do they have adventures where you must go from point A to B to C to D to E to get all the fun? And I think in Vecna Eve of Ruin, which is a quest to get an object, theoretically players can get it earlier. And if they do, the instructions in the book are, well, just take it away from them so they still have to play the rest of the thing, which is pretty brutal and awful advice, I think. And I would tell you, I haven't asked anyone this, but I'm pretty sure this is the answer. The reason that you have all these railroads and fetch quests and stuff like that in D&D 5e products is because you can put them into a book that you can sell for like $50. And like sandboxes oftentimes are shorter. I certainly prefer a sandbox myself, but that style of adventure lends itself better to the production of a large book that is long, hardcover, and will cost a lot of money, which will be more profitable for Wizards of the Coast than a $10 zine. You're going to have to sell an awful lot of $10 zines to equal the profit you would get from a hardcover book. So they're just not going to be as interested in making the zines. But yeah, you asked this question. There I go. So I'll end it there.
Well, I just something that was running through my head as you're kind of going through. That was obviously that was a fantastic answer, and it's one that I think is really interesting. I like that concept of the friction between creativity and capitalism. But one that I just had this line that kept going through my head where you're kind of talking is like the history of Dungeons and Dragons is a parable that the authors of the story refuse to learn from. Like it's so funny that the reason I'm thinking about parables is because I'm currently was teaching that to my students recently, and I'm like, if you read Slaying the Dragon, or you read A Game of Wizards, or you read a lot of the books, it's like it's constant. It's like you would think that the lessons that are out there, that it's amazing how Wizards of the Coast at TSR continues to make the same mistakes throughout the history. There's moments of kind of renaissance for the companies, but many times they seem to fall right back into that. So your concept about like, no, capitalism will always make the best product. No, capitalism keeps, I think, or at least the entanglement between capitalism and humans trying to kind of make it work for them is awkward at best, right? It was funny. You were like, capitalists always make the best product, and I wanted to say, tell that to the Betamax.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, it's interesting. I like that line. I'm going to trademark this concept that history of Dungeons and Dragons is a parable that the authors refuse to learn from. Thank you very much.
There you go. It's a good one.
I'm taking that to the bank.
So, and frankly, if you want to hear more about the rather shocking things that management asked creatives and marketing people to do in the service of 5th edition, give us $3, join our Patreon, and listen to that Battle for the Soul of D&D seminar, because that is one of the major themes of that seminar. So Scott, all you did was give us a great plug for that.
Okay.
Wonderful. But with that, we have gone over, and we should wrap this up. So I am going to say, with that, I am Ben Riggs.
I'm Dr. Scott Bruner.
Thank you all for being here.
Have a wonderful day, folks.